And as we move up from 10,000 cycles per second on your emotional health, we move through the various symptoms of neurosis: worry, fear, anxiety, stress, tension, self-rejection, until we get to a point at point B where we are experiencing an absence of symptoms. However, we know that at any moment, one phone call or one piece of news that is not consistent with what I expect, it's called dissonance. This cognitive or emotional or affective dissonance could literally create in me a state of immobility. So the right phone call or the right action, or somebody having an accident, or somebody not doing what I think they should, or somebody even saying something to me that I dislike, or whatever it might be, and I could instantly go back into 18, 16, 14, and perhaps even 12 and 11 and 10,000 cycles per second. It's been discussed that chronic depression is something that affects as much, I've heard estimates as high as 20% of the population. That people are consuming things like Prozac and antidepressives at an alarming rate. And it's intriguing because there's no such thing as depression. I defy anyone to go out with a container and bring back any depression. The world is just the way it is, and there's no depression in it. There are only people thinking depressing thoughts, and then those depressing thoughts affecting our chemistry, our physical makeup, to a point where we become immobilized. There's no stress in our world. The world is the way it is. There are only people thinking stressful thoughts, and those stressful thoughts become our reality, our detachment from our source, our separation from our source. We start moving away from our source rather than toward it. And as we move in the opposite direction of our source, we find ourselves breaking down, being emotionally immobilized, upset, fearful, anxious, and so on. Now, as I move to my right, on this scale of emotional health, we reach a point called point C. And at point C, at 100,000 cycles per second, we understand the meaning behind Terry Cole Whitaker's title of her book. What you think of me is none of my business. That is, I am living here at a state not in which I am unaffected by, emotionally, the things that occur in my life and in the life of those I love and I'm around, but that I cannot become immobilized by them. I will not allow myself to lose my sense of balance, my sense of connection to God, because of what someone out there might do, even if that someone is very, very close to me, the closest person in my life. I am independent of the good opinion of all of those around me. This is 100,000 cycles per second. Illustrative of it is a story that is told of the Buddha. And everywhere he went, he had all of these followers, but he also had people who were critical of him. And these people would find fault with him, and they would say things about him that were insulting, and they would be very inflammatory, and they would be extremely critical of him. And every time that they would behave in these ways towards the Buddha, he would respond with love, with kindness. That's all he could ever say. And one day one of his students said to him, I just don't understand. For days and days, these people have been so critical and so ugly in their reactions towards you, and always you still react with kindness and love. How do you do that? How does that work? And the Buddha responded with something that I think is very, very relevant to our lives. He said, if someone offers you a gift, and you do not accept that gift, to whom does the gift belong? And that was his answer. If someone offers you a gift of their hatred, of their criticism, of their bitterness, of their tension, of their fault-finding, if they offer this to you, but you don't accept it, to whom does it belong? Why, it's theirs. And the Buddha was saying, why would you ever choose to allow yourself to become depressed, upset, immobilized over something that belongs elsewhere? It's not yours. You don't own it. What you think of me is none of my business. The first is that force always creates a counterforce. Force creates a counterforce, whereas power is always creates grace. Grace and power, over and over again, he reports the research that power is something that will bring grace, that will bring God, will bring consciousness to the presence of it, whereas force always creates a counterforce. So that when you have a force, that is, if you react with shame, if you try to make your children feel ashamed, what are they going to do back? They resent, and what are they going to try to do to you? Some way of making you feel ashamed as well. It happens every time. You just have to watch it. You try to shame them and watch if they don't try to shame you. You said I couldn't do that, and you have to be punished for that. But you did that. You said this right away. Shame creates more shame. You've created a lowered energy field. They're weakened, you're weakened, and it works not just with shame, but with fear, with anxiety, with anger. Every time we use any of these, a counterforce is created. The second quality is that force is always loud, aggressive, whereas power is silent. That you raise energy levels through silence, and there's very little movement required when you are empowering, whereas when you get louder, screaming, aggressive, more outgoing, and so on. The third is that force is always moving against something. That's what force is. So whatever it is that you have, we have to move against it. We have to mobilize our forces and defeat it. Whereas power does not move at all. The fourth thing is that force is always incomplete. Therefore, it must be fed energy. You must constantly feed energy of force. You must constantly be talking to it. You must constantly be upgrading it. You must constantly be trying to make it attract more energy. It's always demanding of energy. Whereas power is total and complete, requires nothing from outside itself. Power does not demand anything out there, not any weapons. It doesn't need any arguments to win. Power is that which you are connected to silently. The fifth, force always makes demands. Whenever you are in force, and if you look at any of those emotions and energy levels below 200, you will see that there's a demand to each one of them. Whereas power has no needs whatsoever. It is at peace. The sixth is force is constantly consuming. It has insatiable appetite. It is constantly demanding more. And in the process, it consumes, and in the process of consuming, it destroys. Power is always content, makes no demands, and needs nothing to consume. 7. Force always takes energy away. It takes your energy and takes it with it. Whereas power energizes. It gives forth. It supplies and supports. And it gives life energy. When you go to God, when you go to Spirit, when you go above 200 to any of those levels, what you are doing is you are energizing those around you and sending it out. Whereas when you're in any of the ones below 200, you are taking energy away. The eighth is that force is always associated with judgment and generally makes us feel badly about ourselves. Any of those emotions, any of those thoughts have to do with judging, and ultimately when you experience those thoughts or you're in the presence of someone who is using those thoughts, you will end up feeling badly or worse for the experience. Whereas power is associated with compassion, radical humility, and always makes us feel positive about ourselves. When you encounter someone whose thoughts are above 200, after that encounter, you will feel better for having been in their presence, based upon not just what you talk about, but even the feelings that you have. Whereas when you're associated with or around people who are using the techniques below 200, you feel yourself feeling badly, worse, and depleted of energy. Number 9, force always polarizes because it demands conflict in order to survive. Force and conflict go together. Power, the energy of power above 200 will unify and make you feel more like you belong, a sense of belonging. Number 10, I just put it this way, in force the cost is always very high because enemies are always being created. Force needs an enemy. It costs to stay in a state of force. Whereas power has no cost whatsoever. It's absolutely free. It's graceful, it's silent, it's easy, it's non-consuming, it makes no demands. The 11th, and I've always been intrigued by this, the 11th quality or characteristic of force, force always requires proof because it's literal and it's therefore arguable. Whereas power deals with intangibles, and it knows that health is better than disease. It doesn't need any proof of that. It knows that honor is better than dishonor. It knows that faith is better than doubt, and that being constructive is better than destructive. And you don't need a chi-square, and you don't need an analysis of variance, and you don't need a statistical test to be able to prove it, and you don't need to argue about it. There's an awareness that is internal, that is instinctive, that says, I don't have to go out there and show anything. It's why it's quiet. I know it is better to be honorable than it is to be dishonorable. I know it is better to be honest than to steal. I don't need proof of that. I know that it is better to be healthy than to be in a state of disease. I know that life is better than death. I know this. I don't have to prove it. I don't have to explain it. I live in a consciousness of empowerment in which I don't have to go through and look outside of myself to validate whether these things that I know instinctively and intuitively are correct.
The purpose of dancing at a dance floor is not to get to someplace else on the dance floor. Your purpose isn't to end up over here, like this is where we're going to end up. So all of this other stuff is irrelevant. Our purpose is to get here. We don't do that. When we dance, we enjoy every single step of the dance, all of the music. And wherever we end up is where we end up. It's just like enjoying a concert. I mean, the purpose of enjoying the concert isn't to get to the end. If that was the case, then the people who conducted the fastest would be the best. And people who wrote only finales would be considered geniuses. Dun, 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 dun. Oh, that was fantastic. You see? It's like peeling a banana. You know, the purpose isn't to get to the other end. It's to enjoy every bite. And the same with life. If we, self-actualizing, fully functioning, highly spiritual people, The great teachers are people who didn't do what they did because they were going to make money off of it, because they were going to be approved of, because it was going to be enduring. They did it because it was what their heart told them they had to do. They have no investment in power or control over others. Their life is not about who I'm better than. See, true nobility is not about being better than somebody else. Everybody's better than somebody else at something and not as good as somebody else at something else. True nobility is about being better than you used to be. It's about growing in your life. That's what nobility is. And highly functioning people they're not looking into other people's lives. The last line of Candide, Voltaire's great novel, this whole story of this wanderer, Candide, this great teacher and sort of comic person. The last line, I guess we'll have to learn to cultivate our own garden. Cultivate your own garden. If other people want to grow rutabagas and you want to grow cabbage, then allow that and be independent of that. But so many people live their lives through what others are doing, how well they're doing it. Fully functioning people let go of that. That they have incredibly high energy and enthusiasm. Enthusiasm, entheos, the God within. When people say to me, what makes a great speaker? I said, be authentic and be enthusiastic. And it doesn't matter what your content is. People will love you if you're authentic and enthusiastic, if they can see the God within you. If they have no concept of failure, there's no such thing. If you take a golf ball and you put it up on a tee and you stand there and you swing at the golf ball and it dribbles off to the side, you haven't failed. You've produced a result. The question is, what do you do with the results you produce? Everything that you do produces a result. You can call it failure and say, well, I'm not good at this, I've never been very athletic, and apply all kinds of labels to yourself. But we should never, ever allow ourselves to think of ourselves as failures, nor should we ever place that label on anybody else, because you can't fail. It's just a judgment. The only difference between a flower and a weed is a judgment. It's just a judgment. And the difference between success and failure is just a judgment. You know, Edison, the great inventor, of course. You know, when asked the question, he had tried 25,000 different ways to invent a battery, and he still didn't have it. And finally someone said to him, how does it feel, someone of your stature, to have failed 25,000 times? He said, failed? I don't know anything about failing. He said, today I know 25,000 ways not to make a battery. What do you know? And every time you do something, every time you go, and it doesn't work, you learn something. And the question isn't whether you failed, it's what do I do with the results I produce? If you pick the golf ball up and put it back on there and say, all right, I'm going to correct that, and you do it again and again and again, eventually, if you go through the 4 pathways, if you practice the discipline and the wisdom and the unconditional love, eventually, when you surrender, you'll know how to hit a golf ball. But you'll never do it the moment you label yourself to be a failure.
I had this really stunning realization one day when I was running, and I saw someone about 30 yards ahead of me who was running. And I was thinking about this concept of the unified life and that we're all one, and seeing the big picture and seeing ourselves as all connected and that we all come from a oneness. And because we're so stuck on our separateness, and I was looking at this runner some yards ahead of me, thinking, how could it be that I am connected to that person? I don't know him. I don't know his name. I don't know anything about him. How could there be any connection between us? It was like this thing dawned on me that I am already an I that is we. In other words, I have many different life forms on me. In my eyelids, I have thousands of bacteria. In my pancreas, in my ears, and all over me, I have like thousands of these different life forms. And yet I think of myself as a singular unit, but I am made up of a lot of life, a lot of stuff that is alive. So if you can get back far enough, again, it's always a question of perspective. If you could leave Earth plane, and you can only do that in thought, and look down and try to see humanity, you would really see one body. I mean, if you could get away far enough, you would see, and it would look, as you get closer and closer and closer, just like as you get closer and closer with a microscope, into a raindrop. A raindrop looks like a raindrop until you start examining it closer and closer and closer, and then you see whole universes within one section of it that have never even had any contact with the other section of it. And so, well, that's the perspective you have to get on us all being connected. We only see it from this very tiny perspective. Now, how you can apply this in your life is just to remind yourself that just because there's a distance between you and somebody else doesn't mean that there's not a connection. That's the beauty of thought again. It wasn't, an hour ago that someone here at the studio said something to me about her father. And I said to her, well, get me your father's address and I'll send him a copy of one of my books. And she said, oh, he would really like that. And then she started talking about her aunt. And she was doing like a little imitation, and it was really funny. And she said, oh, my aunt just loves you. And she lives down in Florida. She said, she loves you. And I said, well, get me her address, and I'll send her one, too. I'd be happy to. And she didn't say anything at that moment. But then as she came to go to lunch with us, she said, you're not going to believe this, but my father called right after I talked to you, and he gave me my aunt's address, which I didn't have before. And she said, isn't that a coincidence? And I said, that isn't any more of a coincidence than that we've been talking about this very thing right here for the last several hours here in the studio in Chicago today, that there is a connection and that you'll see it when you believe it. And all I suggest to you is that you try it. If you pull into a gas station and somebody is right up ahead of you and they're parked in a place where you think you should be, and if they were only up at the pump a little further away, then you would be able to be happy and they would be able to be happy. Don't tell yourself that. See them as being exactly where they are, that you're connected to them, and treat them that way so that you don't treat them with anger. You accept it. It's always acceptance. It's openness and acceptance. What you do is you just pull up in front of them and back your car up a little bit and use that pump. Don't treat that person as if they were separate from you. Treat them as if they were a part of you, because they are. It's just that you can't see the perspective. You will be able to see that perspective. You'll get that when you leave this form that you're so attached to and go into another dimension. You'll see all of humanity as one. You are one of the pieces of this puzzle called humanity. And if you are missing from it, or if you're incomplete, or if you're not in harmony, then you make all of humanity incomplete. And that's exactly how important you are as a person. And if you just start thinking like that, that everybody out there that you run into is somehow, in some way, connected to you, you stop being antagonistic toward them, because you know that if you got antagonistic toward the microbes that live inside the lining of your large intestine and just didn't want them there and said, oh, I'm going to do everything I can to get them out of there, that would kill you. You literally need that life, that I, that is we, the self-contained unit that is comprised of all of life. You have to have all of that. It's equally true on a different level for all of humanity. And you start seeing everybody like that. And before long, you'll start seeing the connections. They'll start being there, but only when you believe it. I tell people, supposing you went to sleep and you had a dream, and in your dream you had all these different characters, and you had all of this money, and you had everything that you wanted in your dream. And then you woke up. And then you look back at your dream, and you became attached to the stuff that you had in your dream. And you said, wait a minute, I want that. There was gold in there. There was silver. There was all of these friends. I had a Ferrari there. I mean, all of this. I got to have that. Somebody would come away and cart you off and put you in a rubber room and say, that was a dream. You can't be attached to that. That's just a thought that you have. That's the way you got to view life. Instead of it being an 8-hour dream, it's an 80-year dream or a 90-year dream. And at the end of the dream, you don't want to be looking back at all of the stuff that you wish you could still have, because you can't have it. You don't get any of that. So you try to detach yourself now, while you're here, while you're alive, from the need to have that stuff. Instead, you just let it sort of all flow. As absurd as it would be for you to be attached to the stuff that you had in your dream, it's that absurd for you to be attached to the stuff that you're having in this dream. You have to die while you're alive. Now, that's a very hard concept for people to get. But you have to experience your own death while you're alive. Let me tell you a story. It's a wonderful story. It's an old, ancient story. I'll paraphrase it. There was a hunter who lived in India. And he would go to Africa every 2 years. And he would bring back animals and prizes and things like that. Well, one year he took off and he went to the jungle. And he discovered this large enclave inside the jungle. And it was filled with beautiful parrots, beautiful birds, multicolored, and they all talked. And he couldn't get over it. And he put a net out over one of the trees, and he captured one of the parrots. And he put the parrot in a cage. And he brought the parrot back to be with him in India as his pet. And he fed the parrot sunflower seeds, and he fed him rice, and he took wonderful care of him. He was very good, kept him in the cage. 2 years went by, and he talked to the parrot every day. And he said to the parrot, "I'm now going back to Africa. Is there anything you would like me to say to your friends back there in the jungle when I'm back there?" The parrot said, "Yes. Tell them that I'm very happy in my cage. Tell them that I am joyful and that I love being in my cage here with you. Just tell them that." The hunter went back to Africa. He went back to the place in the jungle where he had been 2 years before. And he told the story. He said, "Your friend that I took back has a message for you. And the message is that he is happy in his cage, that he is joyful with me, and that he has no regrets." At the instant of hearing that, a bird on one of the branches keeled over and dropped dead. Dropped dead, stiff. The hunter assumed that he was just filled with sorrow at hearing of what had happened to his friend. So he went back to India, and he told his parrot what had happened. He said, "I went back and I did just as you said. And I told them all out there, and at the moment that I told it, apparently one of the parrots was so upset that he'd missed you so much that he just dropped dead. And at the instant that that happened, the parrot in the cage keeled over, dead. His legs went straight up in the air, and he went stiff." The hunter was beside himself. He couldn't figure out how could this happen. And he took the dead parrot out of the cage, opened it up, and threw it out on the woodpile. The instant that the parrot landed on the woodpile, he flew up to the branch. And the hunter said, "You tricked me. What is this? I thought you were dead." And the parrot said, "My friend was sending me a message. He told me, by his actions, that in order for you to escape from your cage, you must die while you're alive." Okay, now that's an old story. That's an ancient story that's been told over the years. What does it mean? I mean, don't you see that this is a cage? That the whole planet is a cage? If you can just stand back far enough and see that we're still restricted by the limitations placed on us as human beings. We're stuck here, or maybe in our homes, or in wherever we are. We're all in cages. And even though we have more room to manipulate, we may even have a whole planet, we're still sort of in cages. Now, how do you escape from the cage that you're in? You have to die while you're alive. You have to literally experience your own death. All of us have to. All of us are going to die. So why not experience it in advance? And see yourself out of your body, gone, but able to look back at what's going on now. Just like the dream, where you have the dream and you have everything you want, but you're able to look back at it. As you do that, you begin to see the folly, the absurdity of hanging on to anything, of being attached to anything, of needing anything, of telling yourself that I can't be happy if, from the perspective of having died, but being able to look back on it just like the dream. As soon as you can do that, as soon as you can experience yourself formless, dimensionless, form and all of the attendant things that you hang on to become irrelevant. They're not necessary any longer. You have a whole new way of living, a new way of being.
A lot of people are looking for the how-tos. You know, how can I become a more spiritual person? How can I find my purpose? And they start with the way that they learn anything, problem-solving logic. A plus B plus C plus D equals whatever it is, and you just go through the steps. It's not like that. When you consider that everything that you have done in your life has led you up until this moment that you have right now, and all of the things that you have assessed to be negative, all of the addictions perhaps that you've had, all of the problems you've had in your marriages, all the problems you've had with your children, all of the weight problems perhaps that you've had, all of the difficulties that have come your way, the financial concerns and the bankruptcies and all of the stuff that if you were to reach into your bag, you know, you could pull out this whole bag full of negative stuff. You get to a point that the Buddhists call satori, S-A-T-O-R-I. Satori. It means instant enlightenment. Instant enlightenment. And the Buddhists believe, by and large, that enlightenment is something that happens in instants. It happens in moments. It's like I've talked about at some of my other tapes about going through the gate. You know, it's like on one side of the gate is the path that is strewn with thorns, all right? And there's all of the stuff that I have just described. And then there's this gate ahead of you. And then on the other side of the gate is this garden. And there's this flowers, and it's just magnificent, and there's happiness, and there's bliss, and there's fulfillment, and there's all of this wonderful stuff on the other side. But you can't get through the gate. And then comes the moment in your life when you go through the gate. You just go through. You know, the thorns that were there don't matter anymore. The obstacles are no longer obstacles. It's just and it's like, boom, instantaneously, you are now on a different path altogether. I can tell you that for those of you who are struggling and trying to find a formula and trying to get it all into A, B, C, D, E, F, it isn't that way. First of all of the thorns and all of the obstacles that have been created in your life are there for a reason, even though that's a hard thing for us to accept. There's something to be learned from each one of those. And so instead of saying, how can I avoid these in the future, you reprocess your life in a different way and say, I created this for what reason? And I'm going through this because, and you fill in the blanks, or the lesson in this for me is, all right, instead of why is this happening to me and isn't this awful and so on. And then satori happens. And I mean, that was very revealing for me to read about this instant enlightenment, because every major change that I've made in my life, I mean, they don't seem like big changes, but the changes that I've made happened in instants. I mean, just in seconds. Now, in the physical world of changes that I have made, I can remember when I first decided that I was going to start running and exercising and get myself in shape instead of being overweight and out of shape like I had been. In an instant. And it was a doctor at a hospital where I wasn't a patient. I was working there. I was training the staff in group therapy at North Shore Hospital on Long Island. And this doctor said one thing to me. He said, if you continue on the path that you're on, you're going to be a candidate for a heart attack in 5 years. He wasn't trying to be helpful to me. He wasn't anything. He just was making a statement. And that evening, I went out and I ran for the first time as an adult. And it's now almost 15 years later. And I haven't missed a day of running in 15 years. It was just like an instant kind of thing, and then it was like carrying through on that. And I mean, that really flies in the face of a lot of the stuff that we hear all the time about you have to have a goal and you have to have a plan and you have to get it all figured out and you have to work step by step by step. I really think that enlightenment or discovering this inner source of strength is something that just happens in an instant whenever you're ready. So whoever you are, I mean, if you're smoking, if you're drinking excessively, if you've got addictive habits in your eating habits and so on, if you are behaving in ways with your children or with your wife or coworkers or whatever, and you think that it's just hopeless and that you can't change and that it's just too difficult to process and so on, I'm really saying to you that in an instant you can decide to radically alter your life. And it isn't like even a decision-making process. You're now ready. The same Buddhists say that when the student is ready, the teacher will appear.